Okay, let's just dive right in. When you think about the Israelites moving to Egypt, you probably picture a desperate family just trying to survive a brutal famine, right? Well, what if I told you it was actually this brilliantly orchestrated divine master plan? Today in this explainer, we are totally shifting our perspective to uncover the profound divine purpose hidden right behind this famous migration. And that brings us straight into a pretty massive historical and theological paradox. Think about it. God had specifically promised Abraham and his descendants the land of Canaan. So for Jacob's entire family to just pack up their livestock, their tents, their whole lives, and completely abandon that very promised land to go live in Egypt, honestly, it feels like a massive retreat, almost like a failure. But as you're going to see, we're going to unravel this paradox today by looking at the actual structural blueprint of this event. So here is our roadmap to figure this all out. First, leaving the promised land. Second, the divine mandate. Third, the table of 70. Fourth, the Goshen strategy. And finally, the ultimate redemptive plan.
Starting with Section 1, leaving the promised land and the paradox of the migration.
To really wrap our heads around this move, we've got to step back into the ancient worldview. Remember, after the rebellion at Babel, God essentially disinherited the other nations, which made Jacob's family his sole focus. So this descent into Egypt, it's not a retreat at all. It's actually the execution of a macro narrative. It's a grand storyline that was foretold to Abraham chapters earlier. God is literally planting them in Egypt to ensure their survival during a global collapse.
Moving to Section 2, the divine mandate and that sacred pause at Beersheba.
Notice that Jacob doesn't just casually wander across the border. He pauses at Beersheba, the very edge of the Promised Land, to ask for divine permission. And God answers him in a night vision. Listen to how he starts. He says, "Jacob, Jacob." He calls his name twice. Now, in the ancient world, repeating a name like that signals urgent covenant business. And by saying, "I am the God of your father," he's reassuring Jacob that leaving Canaan absolutely does not mean leaving the promise.
Right. Then God gives him 3 massive guarantees. First up, national proliferation. Egypt, not Canaan, is going to be the incubator where they grow into a massive nation. Second, divine presence. God promises to actually go into exile with them, proving his presence isn't just locked to one specific piece of geography. And third, personal peace. God offers this incredibly tender promise that Jacob's lost son, Joseph, will be right there to close his eyes when he passes away. Section 3. The Table of 70, the roster of the covenant. Now, what is genuinely fascinating here is how this family tree is categorized. Instead of your standard patriarchal list, it actually honors the 4 matriarchs, Leah, Zilpah, Rachel, and Bilhah, as the active foundational builders of the house of Israel. We see Leah's lineage accounting for 33 descendants, Zilpah's with 16, Rachel's with 14, and Bilhah's with 7. And when you add up that whole clan, you arrive at exactly 70 people. Now, to the ancient Hebrews, you know this wasn't just a random head count. The number 70 is mathematically packed with meaning. 7 represents perfection, and 10 represents completeness. So this is an ideal, perfectly complete unit. And here is where the master plan just comes into brilliant focus. The text deliberately contrasts these 70 souls of Israel entering Egypt with the 70 rebellious nations of the earth that were listed way back in Genesis 10. So this wasn't just a family surviving a famine. They were designed to be the specific vehicle to ultimately restore those 70 lost nations. Incredible, right? Which brings us to Section 4, the Goshen strategy, or preservation through segregation. But before that strategy even unfolds, we get this profoundly emotional anchor. Jacob and Joseph finally reunite in Goshen. They weep, and Jacob basically declares he is totally ready to die in peace, saying, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face." It just beautifully fulfills that promise of personal peace God gave him back at Beersheba. So, following the tears, Joseph gets right down to business. He tells his brothers to introduce themselves to Pharaoh specifically as shepherds. Now, why would he do that? Because Egyptians viewed foreign shepherds as absolute abominations. They despised them. Joseph essentially takes this intense cultural prejudice and weaponizes it to create a divine force field for his family. By leaning hard into that prejudice, Joseph secures Goshen. It becomes this isolated incubator, geographically and socially walled off from mainstream Egypt. Think about it. This segregation protects them from assimilating into Canaanite culture back home and keeps them safe from Egyptian contamination right there, allowing them to quietly grow into a massive nation over the centuries. Section 5. The Ultimate Redemptive Plan and its Echoes in Canonical History. As we zoom out, we can see later New Testament writers organically drawing on this exact event. In Matthew, Jesus retraces this very exile to Egypt journey. Stephen uses it in Acts to prove God doesn't just live in temples, he goes into exile with us. Paul points to it in Romans as the start of a multi-ethnic family, and Hebrews praises Jacob's forward-looking faith. This brings the whole thing together. You see, the historical reality of Goshen isn't just a nice metaphor. The physical, concrete survival of those 70 souls in that isolated incubator laid the very foundation needed to bring Jesus Christ into human history. That physical survival paved the way for universal spiritual redemption. So, this reveals a flawless, sovereign purpose operating right behind what initially looked like devastating upheaval. And it leaves us with a pretty profound question. If God can use displacement and isolation to perfectly execute an ultimate master plan, what might he be orchestrating in the background of your own forced transitions? It definitely invites us to look a little closer at the exiles in our own lives. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.